guys, how's it going? TJ back with you. Dead History here along with Henry.
Hi.
And today is what part, Henry?
Part 3 of our presidential series.
Looking at Abraham Lincoln in this 4-part series, taking a look at Abraham Lincoln. And today we're going to take a look in part 3 at the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Henry, who was the guy who assassinated him?
John Wilkes Booth.
That's right. And where was it at?
A Ford Theater at Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C. Very good, dude. Great job. Yep. That fateful day on April 14th in 1865, when at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by a lone assassin, John Wilkes Booth. We're going to dive into that. We're not going to show you everything as far as John Wilkes Booth's escape route, because I've done that, and we'll do that in another special assassination video. But we will show you photos of Ford's Theater, the Peterson home across the street where Abraham Lincoln actually died at the next day. We're going to show you all that stuff, probably even show you Wilkes Booth's gravesite as well in Baltimore, Maryland. So we're going to dive into all that, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. But first, make sure, hit subscribe down below, like and thumbs up, leave those comments and questions, hit that little notification bell, right, Henry?
Yep, so you can be notified when we release a new video every single week.
That's right, so you can be notified every single week when we release a new video. Great job. So now sit back and relax, because here we go, part 3 of our Abraham Lincoln 4-part series. And this is
Dead History.
Dead History. How's it going, guys? TJ here, along with my son Henry.
Hi.
Behind us, the 16th President of the United States, and also behind us, where the assassination on April 14th of 1865 happened, Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And the amazing thing is, most people don't know, Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14th, but he died the next day on April 15th. So, we're going to dive into all that really fascinating stuff. A lot to cover today. We're really excited. We hope you enjoy it. Get that popcorn out, right? Get those potato chips.
You gotta get potato chips.
You gotta get potato chips, that's right. When you're being entertained, you need that salty snack. So sit back and relax and enjoy part 3 of our 4-part series looking at the man that we all know as the 16th President of the United States. Who, Henry?
Abraham Lincoln.
Enjoy. Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History. And today, part 3 of our 4-part series, taking a look at the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. I hope you've enjoyed parts 1 and 2 so far. Part 1, of course, we took a look at the birthplace and childhood of Abraham Lincoln. And then in part 2, I know it was a long video, but taking a look at the presidency and all the great accomplishments and such that Lincoln had to deal with and overcome and accomplished during his time as president. And now in part 3, this video is entitled April 14th, 1865. And anybody that knows about April 14th, 1865 knows that that was the day that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, lone assassin. Just wanted to preface one thing. Anybody that's familiar with our Dead History channel here on YouTube knows that on November 22nd of last year of 2020, I put out a John F. Kennedy assassination video. November 22nd, of course, being the anniversary date of the Kennedy assassination. That's why I did that, of course. So I think I'm going to be doing the same thing for the Lincoln assassination. Obviously, the anniversary date's April 14th, so in about a month and a half from now. I think I'm going to be doing the same type Lincoln assassination video. And the reason I'm prefacing that is because today in this part 3, I'm just going to give you an overview of the assassination. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Booth, tell you about that night, tell you about Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not going to dive too deep into, because to be completely honest with everyone, I visited everything regarding the Lincoln assassination. When I mean everything, obviously, if anybody knows about this assassination, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln and he escaped. There was a manhunt for John Wilkes Booth for like over a week, literally. He was on the run for a long time. And I visited every location that John Wilkes Booth stop that along his escape route, and before he was finally captured and killed. So I just wanted you guys to know that I'm not going to dive into all those things in this video. I'm not going to go to all these places that Booth visited, or, you know, the co-conspirator stuff with Booth. I'll briefly touch on some of that stuff, but I am not going to get deep into it during this video. So be on the lookout for a possible Abraham Lincoln assassination video come mid-April, and we'll go from there. All right? So here we go. Let's dive right in. So, you know, the bottom line is, for a Southern sympathizing, Confederate sympathizing man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, the Lincoln freeing the slaves, or slavery ending, I should really say, is probably a better way to word it. Slavery ending, the Civil War ending, only 5 days before the assassination took place. The fact that Lincoln obviously won re-election, his victory in 1864, all of these things added up were just completely unacceptable to John Wilkes Booth. He was a Southern sympathizer, even though he was from Maryland, grew up in Maryland, you know, which obviously was kind of a border state. There was obviously a lot of mixed feelings in the state of Maryland. You know, a lot of people that favored the North, a lot of people that favored the South. So Booth just fell as one of those Southern sympathizers. And he did not like Lincoln. He thought Lincoln was detrimental to the country. He thought Lincoln was detrimental to the way of life, especially obviously for the South. He really kind of looked at Lincoln as almost like a tyrant. He just did not agree with him, did not like him. And obviously he was a little bit of, probably had some mental health issues going on as well. You know, somebody to shoot another human being. So, the bottom line is, in the interesting thing is, at Lincoln's second inauguration, when Lincoln was inaugurated for the second time, John Wilkes Booth actually attended the second inauguration. And not only was he at the second inauguration, he actually was seen inside the rotunda of the Capitol earlier that day when Lincoln walked through. And several spectators and several observers said that they saw Booth glaring almost threateningly at Lincoln. And there was actually several people that day that said, you know, this guy, meaning Booth, needs to be watched. Somebody needs to keep an eye on him. So he definitely had really kind of reached a cracking point, if you will, toward when he was going to be obviously doing this, the assassination. So I'm going to read a little excerpt for you, kind of touch on what was going on that day, April 14th of 1865. After shepherding the nation through the bloodiest war in our history, President Abraham Lincoln had reason to be in high spirits. And on April 14th of 1865, Lincoln awoke in a good mood, and those who saw him remembered him to be more cheerful and jubilant than he had been in a long time. At 7 a.m. that morning, he ate breakfast while chatting with his son Robert Lincoln. Robert, who had served with Ulysses S. Grant and witnessed the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse just a few days beforehand. His wife, Lincoln's wife Mary, told him that she would like to go to Ford's Theater that evening to see Our American Cousin, the play. Lincoln enjoyed the theater, and he agreed with her suggestion, even if it was Good Friday. This was Friday, April 14th of 1865. It actually fell on Good Friday. Lincoln met with his cabinet members at 11 a.m., and they discussed the peaceful restoration of the Confederacy to the United States and Lincoln's commitment to his pledge of malice towards none and charity for all. Afterward, Lincoln ate lunch with his wife, and he later toured the USS Montauk at the Washington Navy Yard. After returning from the Navy Yard to the White House, Abraham Lincoln met with several visitors before excusing himself to prepare for the theater. Lincoln arrived at the theater, Ford's Theater, at around 8:30 p.m. He slipped into his seat during the first act. The Lincolns were accompanied that night by Major Henry Reed Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. She was actually the daughter of New York Senator Ira Harris. And as President Lincoln entered, actress Laura Keene stopped in mid-performance to acknowledge the president. And the 1,700 people in the attendance gave President Lincoln a standing ovation as the orchestra struck up "Hail to the Chief." When the ovation died down, President Lincoln slipped into a red horseshoe rocking chair, which I'm going to show you, the actual chair, believe it or not. His personal bodyguard, John Parker, stood at the entrance to the balcony, but John Parker soon decided to head next door to Tulteville's Star Saloon for a drink, leaving President Lincoln unguarded. Mary Lincoln sat next to Lincoln's right, and she held his hand. Approaching about 10 p.m., Mary Lincoln hugged Abraham, but self-consciously whispered, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln smiled, he put her at ease, and he replied gently, "She won't think anything about it." Those were the final words of our 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth, he was a Maryland native. He was born in Bel Air, Maryland. He was born in 1838. He was born into a family of noted actors. John Wilkes Booth himself would eventually take the stage, appearing in an 1855 in Shakespeare's Richard III in Baltimore, Maryland. And despite his Confederate sympathies, Booth remained in the North during the Civil War, pursuing a successful career as an actor. But as the war entered its final stages, he and several associates hatched a plot to kidnap President Lincoln and take him to Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital. Now, I have interesting things here. I have one source that tells me it was on March 20th of 1865, and then I have another source that tells me it was actually on March the 17th of 1865. So right around that time, either the 17th or 20th, somewhere around that middle of March time frame, John Wilkes Booth actually initially he planned to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. After meeting with Confederate spies in the summer of 1864, John Wilkes Booth spearheaded a plot to abduct President Lincoln and bring him to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and he wanted to use Lincoln as a bargaining chip to secure the release of rebel prisoners. On either March 17th or March 20th of 1865, whatever day is really truly accurate, Booth and his fellow conspirators hit along a country road in Washington, D.C., intending to commandeer the presidential carriage that was scheduled to carry Lincoln to a matinee performance of a play at Campbell Hospital to benefit wounded soldiers. Lincoln, however, had a change of plans and never showed up. So John Wilkes Booth soon had to change his plans as well. And then after the fall of Richmond fell to the Union, and then, of course, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Booth decided that he was going to kill Lincoln rather than kidnap him. That's when Booth kind of was like, that's it. It's time for me to do this. I'm going to kill him. So, interesting stuff. Booth, as I kind of just touched on about his acting career, John Wilkes Booth, for the time, he was actually a very well-known actor. In the theater industry, in the theater districts, Booth was a well-known guy, well-known actor, popular actor, a handsome young man. Booth had a lot going for him, to be honest. I mean, he wasn't filthy rich, but he was not poor by any means. Popular, well-known actor, handsome guy. It's just crazy to think. It's just crazy to think of, what took place that day and, the week or so following. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So I'll read you a couple fun facts regarding this. A lot of people don't know Ulysses S. Grant was actually scheduled to be at the event with Lincoln at Ford's Theater that night. I know for a fact that Lincoln invited Grant. I'll kind of read you a little bit about this. Just days after accepting Robert E. Lee's surrender, the Union general accepted. He said he would accept President Lincoln's invitation to attend Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater on April 14th of 1865. But Ulysses S. Grant's wife, however, had recently been the victim of Mary Todd Lincoln's acid tongue and wanted no part of a night on the town with the First Lady. So, I guess Mary Todd Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant's wife, was not a big fan of hers, didn't really want to go hang out with her and be around her. So Ulysses S. Grant actually backed out, citing that the couple's desire to travel to New Jersey to see their children. And I've actually visited the Grant House in New Jersey. This is the house that Grant went to instead of going to Ford's Theater. And this is where Ulysses S. Grant actually found out that President Lincoln had been shot and killed. I'll show you just a quick picture here on the screen of the house, but I'll show more when I am going over Grant's video in our series about that house. But yeah, pretty cool. I visited there. Abraham Lincoln had a surprisingly difficult time to find a replacement to go to the theater to the play with him and Mrs. Lincoln. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax, and even his son Robert Todd Lincoln turned down the tickets before Clara Harris, the daughter of New York Senator Ira Harris, as I said, and her fiance Major Henry Rathbone, they accepted. So interestingly enough, it was supposed to be Ulysses S. Grant there, but it didn't happen. In the first report of the assassination from the Times, the newspaper said Lincoln was actually reluctant to go to the play. After Grant canceled, he actually almost felt like he was, obligated to attend, even though his wife didn't feel well, also, apparently, Mary. He went with apparent reluctance, and he urged Mr. Schuyler Colfax to go with him, but Colfax had made other arrangements. That's what the Times newspaper reported originally back then. And if Colfax had been in the booth with Lincoln, it would have been that the two persons in line to succeed Lincoln would have been in danger, because I'm going to get into now, the John Wilkes Booth thing was a big plot. This was not just an attack on Lincoln. This was part of a larger plot, basically to decapitate the government. Booth and his co-conspirators plotted not only to kill Lincoln, but they were going to kill Ulysses S. Grant that night. They were going to kill Secretary of State William Seward, and they were going to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Of course, when Grant unexpectedly departed and turned down the invitation, that removed him as a target. George Atzerodt, who was one of Lincoln's co-conspirators, he lost his nerve and he chickened out, so to speak, and he failed to follow through on his assignment to kill Andrew Johnson at Johnson's residence in the Kirkwood House Hotel in Washington. And at the same time that Booth was shooting and killing Lincoln, Lewis Powell, who was another one of the co-conspirators of Booth, Lewis Powell stormed Secretary of State William Seward's house, and Powell repeatedly stabbed William Seward, who was bedridden after a near fatal carriage accident some time before. Seward was in a bad carriage accident, was bedridden. Powell storms into his house that night when Booth's at Ford's Theater, stabs this man, badly, and somehow William Seward survived the stabbing and the attack, which is crazy to think, because there was many co-conspirators, just so everybody knows about the Booth thing. But the four real main ones were Booth himself, of course, David Herold. David Herold was like an impressionable and dull-witted pharmacy clerk. David Herold, he had led Booth on the escape route into Virginia. David Herold's the one who was with Booth when he got finally caught and captured. And David Herold, they were captured at a place called Garrett Farm. He surrendered. He didn't put up a fight like Booth did. And David Herold was tried and convicted, and he was actually executed by hanging in July of 1865. So he was the guy that was on the run with Booth that whole time that after Booth escaped. George Atzerodt was German-born. He was a carriage painter, a boatman. He had secretly ferried Confederate spies across southern Maryland waterways during the Civil War. He was recruited by John Wilkes Booth into this whole conspiracy, and his assignment was to kill Johnson, like I said, but he lost his nerve. And then Lewis Powell, he was actually a former Confederate prisoner of war. So he was in the Confederacy. He was a POW. He was a big, tall, strapping young man. And he was recruited to provide the muscle for the kidnapping plot originally. And then when that plan failed, Booth said to him, "Your job now is to go kill William Seward, the Secretary of State." And he actually, not only did he injure Seward, he injured Seward's son, who was in the house at the time, and a bodyguard as well. And Powell was, of course, Lewis Powell was caught, and he was tried and convicted, and he was also executed by hanging in July of 1865. Now, there's a lot of other co-conspirators in this. You know, I'm sure people have heard the name Mary Surratt. You know, there's Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Mudd, you know, John Surratt. I mean, all sorts of things. Edmund Spangler. There's all sorts of people that were involved, co-conspirators, but I'm not going to get into all those. I just wanted to point out the few that were really, obviously, completely involved in the that night, the assassination attempts and such. So, Lincoln at Ford's Theater, what can I tell you? So, obviously, they arrived there around 8:30, standing ovation. You know, interestingly enough, he arrived late for the comedy. He arrived sometime during the first act, but he was in a really good mood, Abraham Lincoln, that night. From all reports and accounts and historians, he laughed several times during the play. You know, he was just in a very jovial mood. You know, I think really what happened was Lincoln had a tremendous weight off of him. I really think that it was just one of those things that after the Civil War was over, he just felt relief. And he was happy to be out on the town with his wife and their guests. And unfortunately, it just didn't go and end the way things, you know, should have went. Ironically enough, here's a little side note. Abraham Lincoln actually created the Secret Service only hours before his own assassination. Yeah. On April 14th, the day of the assassination, Abraham Lincoln signed legislation creating the U.S. Secret Service. Obviously, that evening, he was shot and killed. Even if the Secret Service had been established earlier, it would not have saved Abraham Lincoln because the original mission of the Secret Service, the original mission of law enforcement agency, was to combat widespread currency counterfeiting. So really, the Secret Service was established by Lincoln to try to dissuade counterfeiting of money. It wasn't until 1901, after the killing of two other presidents, which are President Garfield and President McKinley, it wasn't until after both of those were killed that the Secret Service was formally assigned to protect the president, protect the commander-in-chief. That was obviously their main thing. But interestingly enough, I mean, I always found that pretty cool and interesting. Another interesting fact, a little side note about Booth. John Wilkes Booth's brother actually saved the life of Lincoln's son once. A few months before the assassination, the president's oldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, he stood on a train platform in Jersey City, New Jersey, believe it or not, my home state. That's actually where my father's from, Jersey City, New Jersey. A throng of passengers began to press the young man backwards, and he fell into an open space between the platform and the moving train, and suddenly a hand reached out and pulled Robert Todd Lincoln to safety by his coat collar. Robert Todd Lincoln immediately recognized his rescuer, who was a famous actor, Edwin Booth. He was the brother of John Wilkes Booth. And in another, I'll get into it, there's another eerie coincidence regarding Booth's brother, Edwin Booth, and even Ford's Theater, and I'll get into that in a minute here. So, Yeah, I mean, just craziness, the way this all went down and how this all happened with Booth and the co-conspirators and, some little ties with Lincoln, and it's just crazy. Here's another thing I'll read to you guys. So about 15 minutes after, about 10:15, after Lincoln had said those final words to his wife, John Wilkes Booth entered the balcony during the third act and bolted the door behind him. On stage, the characters bickered and the audience erupted in laughter. And just as Wilkes Booth had planned, the raucous noise gave him enough cover that he needed. He yelled, "Freedom!" and he pulled the trigger of a small single-shot 44 caliber Derringer pistol only inches away from Lincoln's head. Lincoln obviously slumped forward, and that was it. So, interestingly enough, about when he shot him, he snuck in, bolted the door behind him. Pictures you're seeing on your screen now are drawings and paintings and such of, what that might have looked like when Booth was sneaking into the balcony to shoot Lincoln. And the interesting thing is, Henry Rathbone, who was obviously there, as Lincoln's guest, he stood up and, rushed at him. He rushed and tried to basically grab Booth. And what happened was Booth had a knife on him as well as the pistol, and he stabbed Rathbone. He stabbed him in the shoulder, but he stabbed Rathbone in the shoulder that caught him in a spot that he was bleeding severely. Henry Rathbone almost did die. He almost bled out. Obviously, he did survive, but he almost bled out. And then what happened was Booth leapt from the balcony onto the stage. And I'll read here about you. As Booth leapt from the balcony onto the stage, John Wilkes Booth's boot got tangled in the American flag that was hanging off the balcony, and he broke his leg or his ankle in the fall. Obviously, he still had the knife, the dagger in his hand, and brandishing that dagger, he stood on stage and he yelled out, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the translation, the Latin term for "the South is avenged." I apologize. He actually yelled out, "The South is avenged." And then he yelled out, "Sic semper tyrannis." That is the Latin term for "thus always to tyrants." That was actually the Virginia, I believe it's the Virginia state motto, "Sic semper tyrannis." So, interesting, crazy stuff. So amid all this confusion now, Booth amazingly escaped the crowded theater. Immediately someone shouted, "Is there a doctor in the house?" And the first physician to respond was Charles Augustus Leal. Since Booth had bolted the entrance to the balcony, Dr. Leal was lifted into the box. A 23-year-old assistant surgeon of the United States Volunteers and recent graduate of Bellevue Hospital Medical College, he'd come to play the first to catch a glimpse of Lincoln, but instead found himself as the physician in charge of the president until his death. He immediately took over, demanding that people fetch him brandy and water. Mary Lincoln was holding her husband. Dr. Leal gently lowered him to the floor. First, he felt for a pulse, but he didn't find a pulse. Having seen Booth with the dagger, he assumed the president had been stabbed, but could not find a wound. He opened Lincoln's eyes, and he could see there was brain trauma. So he felt through his blood-matted hair, and he found an open wound where some of his brain was oozing out, supposedly. He removed the blood clot, but Dr. Leal knew the president would die. Nobody had ever survived such a wound. And at this time, when all this is happening, Booth now has escaped. He's ran out. He's gone through the back alleyway behind Ford's Theater, and he's taken off. He's gone. Now, amazingly enough, in the aftermath of all this is now when Booth's escaping. He crossed over a bridge. Eventually, he met up with David Harold, and they escaped. They escaped into Maryland, and then eventually into Virginia. I'm not going to get into all that, but that was their escape route, and they were on the run for over a week. So there you go. Pretty crazy stuff. So in the aftermath of all this going on, obviously at the same time, William Stewart had been stabbed at his home in Washington. Andrew Johnson, his life was saved because Axelrod chickened out and he didn't even go through with it. So this is all going on at the same time. And then what happened was several soldiers actually carried President Lincoln's body across the street to a boarding house, and they placed him on a bed. That boarding house was actually the Petersen House. The Surgeon General arrived at the Petersen House, and he concluded that President Lincoln could not be saved and would probably die during the night. Just to kind of give you guys a little bit of, background on that. The doctors at first, they considered taking Lincoln next door to that Tulteville's Star Saloon. But before they could choose such an undignified location, a man on the doorstep outside, across the street from the theater, he beckoned them. The man, his name was Henry S. Safford, and the home belonged to a German tailor, William Peterson, and his wife, Anna. Safford led the doctors to a room in the back that was being rented by Private William T. Clark, a Union soldier from Massachusetts infantry who was out celebrating the end of the war. The room that they brought him into in the Peterson home, it was a minuscule, claustrophobic 15 by 9 foot room, and so was the bed. It required the 6'4" Lincoln to be laid out diagonally because he couldn't fit on the bed. People were crowding around Lincoln as he laid on the bed, and then Dr. Leal ordered them out so he could examine Lincoln. And basically, that's kind of what happened throughout all this, congestion and craziness. That's what went on. What else can I tell you here, just to kind of get into things? So Andrew Johnson, around 2 a.m. that morning, Vice President Johnson arrived at the Petersen House. Robert Lincoln arrived with Senators Charles Sumner and John Conness and William Stewart. Throughout the night, doctors recorded Lincoln's vital signs. His pulse seesawed from weakened 42 at around 11:15. Then it was racing to 95 at around 1:30 a.m. It just was not going well at all. Just to kind of give you a little final thing here. It was raining at dawn, and as the city awoke to the tragic news of Lincoln's assassination, a crowd gathered outside the Petersen House while guards stood at the door and on the roof. And at the end of Abraham Lincoln's life, Dr. Taft, who was a doctor that came in, he noted the precise seconds, information not recorded for any other president. Abraham Lincoln took his last breath at 7:21 and 55 seconds, and 15 seconds later his heart stopped beating. At 7:22:10 on April 15th of 1865, that morning, Abraham Lincoln died. Besides the physicians, Senator Charles Sumner, Major John Hay, General Henry Halleck, General Montgomery C. Meigs, Reverend Gurley, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and stenographer James Tanner, and Lincoln's son Robert were all in the room when he died. A silence hung over the room and was broken by Edwin Stanton, who uttered the brief and poignant statement. This statement actually is etched on the wall behind Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois, and that statement was, "Now he belongs to the ages." And that was it, ladies and gentlemen. It was, again, 7:22 in the morning on April 15th. He was only 56 years old, and President Lincoln had died. The president's body was placed in a temporary coffin. It was draped with a flag and escorted by armed cavalry to the White House, where surgeons conducted a thorough autopsy. And during the autopsy, Mary Lincoln sent the surgeons a note requesting that they clip a lock of Lincoln's hair for her. Edward Curtis, who was an Army surgeon in attendance, later described the scene, recounting that a bullet clattered into a waiting basin during the doctor's removal of Lincoln's brain. He wrote that the team stopped to stare at the offending bullet, the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize. So, crazy stuff. That was it. That was the death of Abraham Lincoln. A couple little side notes that I want to get into before closing this out. The lives of Lincoln's guests, Henry Rathbone and his wife at Ford's Theater, they actually ended in tragedy as well. Very ironic. After Lincoln was shot, and like I told you, Booth stabbed Henry Rathbone from his elbow to his shoulder. He recovered from the stab wounds, but not from his trauma of that night. He was pretty messed up from that night. Rathbone and Harris did marry. She was also his stepsister, believe it or not. They married in 1867, and Rathbone grew increasingly erratic and perhaps suffered from post-traumatic stress. And then 2 days before Christmas in 1883, Rathbone fatally shot and stabbed his wife before stabbing himself repeatedly in a suicide attempt. Once again, however, Rathbone survived his own knife wounds, and he lived out the remaining 3 decades of his life in an asylum for the criminally insane. He was the 4th member of the presidential box on the night. So Mary Todd Lincoln, who was the 4th member, I should say, it was Lincoln, his wife, Mary Todd, Rathbone, and his wife. She was also institutionalized, Mary Todd Lincoln, in 1875. So obviously, she had a lot more tragedy than just even that night, but took its toll on a lot of people. They did, I told you that, another quick thing, Booth and Lincoln, they had a previous encounter prior to the Ford's Theater that night. Actually, on November 9th of 1863, the Lincolns watched a performance of The Marble Heart, which was starring John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. They actually attended a play that he was starring in. Mary Clay, one of Lincoln's guests, recounted after the assassination that twice Booth, in uttering disagreeable threats in the play, came very near and put his finger close to Mr. Lincoln's face. After Booth gestured menacingly toward the president a 3rd time, Mary Clay said, "Mr. Lincoln, he looks as if he meant that for you." And President Lincoln replied, "Well, he does look pretty sharp at me, doesn't he?" That was 2 years beforehand, or about a year and a half before the actual assassination. So pretty eerie, pretty crazy stuff. What else can I tell you? Here we go. What I was mentioning. Tragedy struck Ford's Theater during Booth's brother's funeral. So when John T. Ford, he attempted to reopen Ford's Theater to performances on July 10th of 1865. Stanton, who was opposed to its ever being again used as a place of public amusement, he dispatched heavily armed soldiers to prevent the show from going on. The federal government eventually purchased Ford's Theater for $100,000, gutted the auditorium, and converted it into War Department offices. But on June 9th of 1893, at the precise moment when the funeral services for Edwin Booth were beginning inside New York's Church of Transfiguration, so when Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's brother's funeral was happening, June 9th, 1893, 3 floors of Ford's Theater collapsed into the basement, and they killed 22 federal workers that were in the building at the time. How crazily eerie is that? I mean, that's just weird. I don't know. At least to me, it's weird. What else can I tell you here? Just to kind of wrap this all up. Okay, so we know about his death, Lincoln's death. It was not universally mourned in the North. Martha Hodes recounts in her book Mourning Lincoln, some Northerners who thought Lincoln too dictatorial, too much of a dictator, and some radical Republicans who thought him too lenient toward the Confederacy, they actually welcomed the news of his assassination. After a meeting of radical Republicans hours after the shooting, Indiana Congressman George Julian recorded in his diary that the universal feeling among radical men here is that his death is a godsend. Michigan Senator Zachariah Chandler wrote to his wife that God had permitted Lincoln to live only as long as he was useful, and then substituted a better man, quote-unquote Andrew Johnson, to finish the work. Not really sure how anybody could think that Andrew Johnson was a better man than Lincoln, but to each his own, I guess. Afterwards, after all this happened, Abraham Lincoln's deathbed in the Petersen home quickly became a tourist attraction. In the hours after Lincoln died in the back bedroom of William Peterson's boarding house across the street from Ford's Theater, souvenir hunters ransacked the property and snatched numerous relics of the martyred president. Deciding to cash in himself, Peterson began to charge admission to the hundreds of curiosity seekers who came each day to see Lincoln's bloody deathbed, which incredibly continued to be slept in by tenant William Clark each night. Peterson fell into financial difficulty in around 1871, and he died after being found on the lawn of the Smithsonian Institution following an opium overdose. So he overdosed, William Peterson. Another weird thing, Robert Todd Lincoln, who was nearby when his father was shot, and he was there when his dad died, he was also in close proximity to two other presidential assassinations. He actually was serving as James Garfield's Secretary of War, when he witnessed Charles Guiteau fire 2 gunshots that mortally wounded James Garfield inside of the Washington, D.C. train station in 1901. And Robert Todd Lincoln also arrived in Buffalo to attend the Pan American Expo at the invitation of President William McKinley, only to learn that McKinley had just been shot. And Robert Todd Lincoln, that is, he visited William McKinley's bedside several times before William McKinley died. So Robert Todd Lincoln, that's crazy. He was involved in around surrounding his father's death, Garfield's death, and McKinley's death. And he was also at the signing of the Treaty of Surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to end the Civil War. So unbelievable life for Robert Todd Lincoln. Just a little side note that I wanted to say there. So that's pretty much it, guys. Booth was on the run for a long time, as I told you. They finally captured him and killed him right on the spot. We'll get into that in an assassination video. But here you go. This was the assassination and the death of Abraham Lincoln. What I'm going to show you now, before we wrap things up, I'm going to show you, I've been showing you a few pictures, but I'm going to show you the rest of my pictures of Ford's Theater, and of the Petersen House across the street. I've been inside both these places before in the past when I was younger. I don't have any pictures inside. I'll use some stock photos for the pictures inside. So the pictures outside, you'll see myself, you'll see me and Henry. Those are pictures I took last year, within the past year. The pictures inside of these places are stock photos that I did not personally take. I'm also going to show you pictures now of the death chair, the actual chair that Abraham Lincoln sat in when he was killed. This is the chair. This is actually at the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. This is the actual rocking chair that Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed in. This is the chair he was sitting on in Ford's Theater. So take a look at those pictures as well. That's fascinating. I was unbelievably fascinated by that. So Ford's Theater, the Petersen House where Lincoln died, the chair, of course, that Lincoln died at was shot in. He was shot in. And I'm also going to show you the grave site of John Wilkes Booth as well. John Wilkes Booth is buried in Baltimore, Maryland. And I'll also show you too. I'll put a little picture with a little arrow. A lot of people think that the grave site, it's a Booth family plot, just so everybody knows. The family members are all buried there. They think that the little unmarked grave headstone that has pennies on it, people put pennies on it, is Booth's headstone. That's not true. Booth is actually buried in this patch of grass behind the big Booth monument here. That's where his body is. So he was buried with his ashes of 3 of his other siblings in that area behind the obelisk. It's in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. the Booth Cemetery, the Booth gravesite. So I'll show you that as well. So this is what all these pictures are going to be on the screen here over the next couple minutes. And then that's pretty much it. Enjoy these pictures real quick. And there you have it. John Wilkes Booth. His gravesite in Baltimore, Maryland. The chair that Lincoln was shot in that sat in Ford's Theater. And, of course, Ford's Theater itself and the Peterson home where across the street where Lincoln died at. All of it right there. Pretty cool stuff. So there you have it, guys. Hope you enjoyed this. A look at April 14th and briefly April 15th of 1865, the assassination and the untimely, unfortunate, sad death of our 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Hope you enjoyed this part 3. Stay tuned. Part 4, our conclusion will be tomorrow. The conclusion will be, of course, the death, I'm sorry, not the death, the funeral procession, the train procession, and the tomb, the Lincoln tomb in Springfield, Illinois. We will go through all of that, where we finally laid our 16th president to rest. So thanks for joining, guys. Hope you enjoyed this. Any comments, questions, anything like that, leave them below. And we'll see you tomorrow for our conclusion, part 4. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.